Well, thank you all for coming out this morning to hear all of these wonderful talks. I've learned a lot from the two talks already. And now we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit about treatment. I have some disclosures, not the least of which is I have bribed my own children to eat vegetables. So we're going to look backward as well as forward, because we do learn from history. And I'd like to just start with this slide of you are what you eat. Many of you remember that from the macrobiotic phase of the 1960s, but the phrase you are what you eat was really introduced to the American culture in the 1920s as an advertisement for meat products, looking towards more natural foods. But that was a paraphrase of a comment that was written 100 years prior to that in France, where a writer named Brillant Saravan wrote that if you show me what a man eats, I will tell you what they are. So I thought about asking my patients about this. And since you're all related to autism, you can relate to this. And we'll come back to that. The reason why diet and what you eat is really sort of very intrinsic in how we think about treatment, how we think about management. It impacts what you do every day. People with autism, and I'll say children because I'm a developmental pediatrician, but I mean across the lifespan, that people with autism are picky eaters. They're selective eaters. They have fewer foods that they eat. They have selective eating that starts very early in childhood, even before the autism is diagnosed. Large studies have documented that sleeping and eating problems are found really before autism is even suspected. And the selective eating persists. We did a study looking at taste and smell in adolescents, and parents reported that they were making separate meals for their teenagers with autism. This is because of perhaps sensory differences in autism, perhaps the perseveration and obsessions that are inherent in the disorder, perhaps because of anxiety or true food neophobia, fears about new foods. We wanted to see if the selective eating actually caused nutritional deficits, which would impact either behavior or general health. And to do this, we looked at almost 300 children across 5 autism treatment network sites and found that there were nutritional deficits in vitamin D, in calcium, vitamin K, potassium, fiber. But when we compared this to NHANES, the National Study of Nutrition, what we found out is that children with autism had crummy diets, but so did other children in America. And these children were compared to matched kids by gender, age, and SES in NHANES. So that the poor diet isn't necessarily unique to autism. And as you look at some of these nutrients, you say, gee whiz, you know, if you have decreased calcium and vitamin D, is it any surprise that adults with autism have increased fractures? And if you have poor fiber intake, it is any surprise that you have constipation. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't children who have particularly selective diets. And in upstate New York, where we have no sun, we do see a couple of cases of rickets every year. And we have had children with scurvy because of vitamin C deficiency. So that there are children with autism who have very, very selective diets. This is just a visual displaying that even when children or people with autism have decreased calcium or vitamin D intake and are supplemented, the dark bars that you see there are the very last line, is to point out that even with supplementation, people aren't meeting their nutritional needs. So we have to be very thoughtful about how we supplement. Now, this is an example of a real live food record from a real live patient, and you can see that his major food group is cheese crackers. I won't name the brand, but you can read it. And you might say, gee whiz, how can a child who eats cheese crackers and chicken nuggets have a diet that looks this good? This is a readout from one of our study patients, the same patient whose record you just saw. The green bars are the nutrients that are sufficient. The red bars are the ones that are in excess. And that's to introduce to you the concept of upper limit, that there is an upper limit beyond which if you eat too much of that, you can have side effects. The yellow bars are the deficits. And the reason why this child who ate nothing look so good is because of food fortification. That when you think about what you eat, I don't think nature intended for vitamins to be in water. And I certainly don't think that nature intended for vitamin C to be in candy. So that we have a highly fortified food supply. So even children on very restricted diets are being supplied with nutrients that you wouldn't necessarily find in that composition in nature. Now, if we talk about food, we talk about too little, but we also talk about too much. That I would be very negligent if I didn't mention that people with autism have a huge obesity problem, and that people with obesity have less energy, they have poor attention, they're at risk for sleep apnea, and people with autism may be obese because of this food selectivity. That you could imagine if what you ate were chicken nuggets and goldfish crackers forever, that you would have a calorie surfeit, and you have fewer leisure opportunities across the cognitive ability scale. You use medications that increase weight, and we certainly have perhaps genetic risk for overgrowth. So don't forget obesity. Now let's get back to the question of, is food medicine? And this really goes back to what John said earlier as well, that food and what we eat is really an environmental factor related to both risk and treatment. This is from an ad from the Atlantic Monthly in 1922 with a commentary about nutritional yeast. And to introduce some history again, many of you remember in the 1970s there was an allergic hypothesis that food dyes, artificial food dyes, caused ADHD. And the question of whether or not this was true was supposedly answered at the time. And the research did not support that food dyes were associated with ADHD. Recent studies, however, are not quite so certain that artificial food coloring and artificial preservatives may actually increase ADHD symptoms in susceptible children in this subgroup, this perhaps genetic subgroup of individuals. And I was showing these slides to a colleague of mine who said to me, how come you put up these Canadian candies in your slide? And I just show this to show you that there's different ways of interpreting evidence, because if you go north of Rochester, you can't buy food with artificial food coloring. So the data is up for interpretation. So what about with autism? We were talking earlier about the gluten and casein-free diet. The people with autism have lots of GI problems. Selective eating. Could diet contribute to both symptoms and cause? There were some observations that were made years ago about the oligoenchogenic diet, where you take away lots of foods and put them back one by one. And a hypothesis was generated that could a leaky gut that allowed for morphine-like products from gluten, which is the protein that gives elasticity to baked goods, and casein, cause symptoms of autism. And because of that, there was a tremendous amount of popularity. And in our studies, maybe about 15% of the children were on gluten and casein-free diets. In large studies, about 20% of families report its use. So we and many others have tried to study this. It's hard to study. And this is just a summary of some recent articles. One of the problems is that it's hard to do a study design where people don't know what they're giving their children. So it's almost impossible to do a placebo-controlled study. And that really contaminates your data, because if you're going to all that effort to change your diet and you're the ones reporting on the outcome, it's very hard to interpret, did that diet make a difference? So the two studies that looked at outcome data that was blinded were not able to identify any differences with dietary intervention. And one of the other complications with doing these studies is that we know that there are other effective treatments, so that if you have a child that's on a dietary intervention that's getting other interventions, it's really hard to tease those apart. So we don't have evidence at this time that the gluten and casein-free diet changes symptoms of autism. We do have evidence that it's safe. And this is something that, we have to always look at the question with any treatment, is it safe and is it effective? And they're two very different questions. And in looking at the large group of kids across the Autism Treatment Network, we documented that children with autism who were on the diet in the community had equal nutrition, equally crummy nutrition to everyone else, except they ate a little bit better in terms of vitamin E because of the nut products. So looking at the extant literature, we don't have a lot of evidence at this point that really diet treats symptoms of autism. There are lots of individual studies looking at other supplements. The literature is flawed. And why is it difficult to study the effects of dietary interventions? Because of all the reasons, the things that Summer summarized around girls, things that John summarized about the genetic heterogeneity of autism, that you need a large study sample, you need to know what the baseline is, you need to hold all the other interventions constant, and you need to look at the outcome variables that might be affected. And the study that we did, which was a double-blind, placebo-controlled challenge study, we didn't just look at core symptoms of autism. We looked at sleep, we looked at stool frequency and consistency, we looked at hyperactivity using actometers. You cast a wide net because there's a lot that goes into quality of life. And despite the lack of evidence, we have this societal belief that healthy eating is good for you. And I think we all believe this is a core, that you can't ignore the rest of physiology, that you need to have enough iron if you're going to sleep at night and pay attention, that you need to eat a healthy diet. One of the things that makes dietary treatments very effective, very popular, is that there's no waiting list, that you can go online, read about it, and start it tomorrow. And one of the other factors that parents will often say to me is, well, show me the data behind, and then they fill in the blank of whatever conventional treatment we're recommending. And as we'll talk the rest of the day, we don't have a lot of really good data about a lot of available treatments, so that, we do as a society believe that you are what you eat. And a whole different talk would be what you eat eats. So as you look at what your children eat and what you eat for health and wellness, remember that it does affect your behavior, it does affect your general health, and you really want to be very overt with telling your clinician what it is you're doing, because what you may be doing nutritionally may be changing pharmacologically other things that you may be using in treatment or considering. I'd like to thank my colleagues at the University of Rochester across the Autism Treatment Network, and especially I'd like to thank all of the families and the children who participated in our studies and who really asked the hard questions, because without your questions, we really don't know where to look for answers. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your attention.